Everybody, welcome. Emergency, instant reaction. I was in the middle of putting up my Christmas tree when I get a phone call from Christopher Nee, 24/7 Sports. We got some news to drop for you guys. Florida State has dismissed, and Mike Norvell has dismissed his offensive coordinator, Alex Atkins, his defensive coordinator, Adam Fuller, and wide receivers coach and FSU alumni, Ron Dugans. That just happened today in the wake of another embarrassing loss for Florida State at Notre Dame. A lot of these moves, or at least some moves, were talked about happening in this bye week. I'm a little surprised, to be honest with you, how many and some of the names that we saw. So I can't wait to get into that with the venerable Chris Nee. Before that, housekeeping, Chattanooga whiskey. I know you guys have been drinking it all season. Keep drinking it. It makes us happy. It makes you happy. You get through the day. They've got the standard stuff. They got the artisanal stuff. It's whatever you need for your hooch desires. Chattanooga whiskey's got you. Like I always say, drink the whiskey, sell your house. And if you sell your house, you want to use the Turner Group. Buy, sell, rent, Airbnb, Verbo, whatever. The Turner Group has got you. And they are all over Florida and wherever else you need. They're the best. They're professional. Drink your whiskey, sell your house. Okay, that's it. Chris.
Trey.
How about it, man? Are you... Number one, did you expect? We've talked about midseason firings for like a month now. Did it make sense? Would it ultimately do anything? Are you surprised that Mike actually pulled the trigger and the names that you saw today?
All right, so I'll unpack the thoughts on that kind of slowly but surely. I think obviously there was some clamoring from prior to the Duke game. That was FSU's last bye. FSU had 3 byes this season with a week 0 on a longer calendar for this season. All teams have 2. FSU had 3 because of the week 0 game. I don't think they did it at the time of Duke because they felt like they could reset to some degree at that point, and they believed they would be a better football team down the stretch. Not that they suddenly were going to go on this magical run or anything, just that they would be better. And the focus at that point was self-evaluation of the team, trying to be better moving forward. That's why changes did not happen internally at that point. I think this timing does make sense. You have another bye week. Bye weeks always give you the chance to sort of reset in the sense of what change, how did the players handle it? You know, any feelings that need to be basically dealt with can get dealt with. You have 2 weeks instead of the 1 week. You're not solely focused on the next game. This allows some of that. Am I surprised by the 3 that got dismissed, which were offensive coordinator Alex Atkins, defensive coordinator Adam Fuller, and wide receivers coach Ron Dugans? I'm not surprised by the dismissal of Fuller or Dugans. I wholeheartedly expected Dugans to be dismissed. His group's been a massive disappointment. His recruiting's consistently been a disappointment. There's been an effort in the past to replace him by Mike Norvell. That fell short. That did not happen. So that was one that I always sort of felt like as things started trending towards this direction. And anytime you're 1-9, nobody's job is safe, obviously. That I always felt like Dugans was going to be one they certainly moved on from, especially because your head coach is so familiar with that position, knows what it's supposed to look like. And he's so frustrated with what it is this year. Drops, poor play, inability to do anything to help any of the 3 quarterbacks that have played this year out, so on and so forth. So Dugans was by far the least surprising to me. And his timing is probably the least surprising to me because he has the smallest of the 3 roles among those. He's also a guy that currently is really not attached to any recruits because all of the receivers that were committed in the class have parted with the class. And any receiver that they're truly pursuing moving forward, like Javon Boggs, or the young man that's in JUCO, I think there's enough relationships there where you can survive moving on from Dugans with those young men because of what you've done in recent weeks with their recruitments. Adam Fuller is someone I thought they would move on from. I just, personal opinion, I think the time had come. That defense was bend, don't break. It doesn't really go out and win you football games. It doesn't do enough. I also think the messaging had become stale. He's not an asset in any way, shape, or form as a recruiter. He's a good evaluator of talent, but he's not good at going and acquiring the talent. I felt like they would move on from him. I'm always hesitant with the idea of coordinators for a multitude of reasons. One, I think there's some optics in this case where when you're moving on from Adam Fuller for the next 2 games, your defensive coordinator is going to be Randy Shannon. There's, of course, plenty of fervor for his dismissal. People that don't like what he's done as a recruiter. I feel like the position certainly can be better. There's an argument to be made there. I think there was some hesitancy with the idea of him moving on to that role, which is what he will do for the next 2 games for FSU. And that's because of experience in that role more than anything. That's why he's getting it. I think the other reason is just when you move on from the coordinator, you're basically moving on from the guy who has his fingers in everything involved with that side of the ball, especially in Adam Fuller's case, because he truly does coach the defense as a whole. He builds a scheme, game plan, so on and so forth. He's, offensively, we're going to talk about Alex Atkins, and it's not the same. He has the offensive coordinator title. In Alex Atkins' case, it's more title than a role.
Right.
And that's
It's
not to
collaborative with
diminish
Mike.
him.
Yeah.
Right. In Adam Fuller's case, it is much more his role. And truthfully, it's the greatest role he served at FSU. I think it's a good thing for FSU. I think it's indicative of the likelihood that that entire side of ball is relatively refreshed. Maybe not all, but I think there's certainly more to come on that side of ball. I just think that there's a realization within the building that FSU's defense is not up to snuff unless the players are NFL high quality players. And there's probably an argument that could be made for that on both sides of the ball. Certainly, I believe that. But I think on defense, it's more a matter of like the inconsistencies of that side of ball are just too concerning, too consistent. They were there before the downfall of 1-9. Outside of last year at the end of the year where that defense was humming because you had guys like Fisk and Verse and so on and so forth up front, kind of dominating the action, doing things. There's always been a bit of a hesitancy to believe FSU's defense was built to win you football games. Certainly didn't lose you games.
Mm-hmm.
And this year, the offense is certainly the culprit of losing you games. It's the worst offense in college football. But the defense isn't really built to win you games. You can't basically go since September without a turnover, too. Like that, it's just simply not allowed.
No.
And that's, Adam Fuller mission takeaway is a thing. He's always emphasized it, but this group was miserably bad at it. I certainly think that played a role. Flipping to the offensive side, beyond Dugans that we already talked about, Alex Atkins is dismissed. Yes, he has the offensive coordinator title. It's more title than reality of role. It's Mike Norvell's offense. He's more the O-line coach. Again, a position group that just was pathetically awful this year. And it's one that was supposed to be a strength. That's probably the thing that most doomed Alex Atkins this season is that his group was supposed to be sort of one of those backbones of what this football team was supposed to be, which was, ultra veteran center and Maurice Smith. He's regressed, had issues with snapping. Health has always been an issue with him, but they've had an inability of replacing him in his career here. And it's something that Alex Atkins would almost jokingly say, but it's also true. They have not effectively recruited to replace Maurice Smith in the sense of where a guy could do it right now for them. Jake Rizzi has ascended some, been playing some guard, which has helped him. Darius Washington, billed by head coach Mike Norvell as a potential All-American candidate, was an All-ACC player a season ago, has regressed, had a miserably awful year, hasn't been good, certainly hasn't been reliable, and it's been downright painful to watch. Jeremiah Byer is a 2-year guy for them at tackle on the other side. His warts are still his warts. They were his warts when he walked in the building, and they're still there. Guard situation has been an utter mess. Richie Leonard was a nice piece before the injury. Once that injury happened, they really had no consistent good answer there. You've played TJ Ferguson, who is arguably the worst D1 offensive guard in college football for the amount of snaps he has played this season. I'm not even trying to be a smartass there.
No, I think Clay put something. He's like 1,600 out of 1,600 for his run blocking grade.
Like he's been horrendous.
He's the worst. Yeah.
And he's a guy that they really liked and they believed was going to be a big piece for them. And it hasn't been. Keandre Jones, between being healthy and kind of being a guy who's imbalanced in the sense of he's better at one thing than the other. So he's not really made for every snap of a game or the philosophy of what you're going for that game. That's been an issue. Andre Otto's been a bit thrown in the fire with mixed results, does have a bright future. But I think the thing with the O-line is that group felt like one that obviously should have been a strength. And you're 10 games into the season with 9 different combinations in those 10 games. And that group hasn't gotten any better. And it's truthfully very concerning how close to the razor's edge they are at some positions. If another guy was to get dinged up or something, how much it likely falls off. Center is an example of that. Tackle, left tackle, true left tackle is an example of that because I don't believe Lucas Simmons is a guy ready to play a Florida, Notre Dame, a Miami, teams that have high-level defensive ends coming at him. I don't think he's currently prepared for that because he lost so much of last year and then had this year. It's just sort of like the cupboard. They thought they had a stacked cupboard. It was one of those things celebrated in the spring, celebrated in preseason, tackles with a ton of reps, good depth, 10 to 12 guys we think we can rely on. None of that held true. And I think that's ultimately one of those things that really hurt Alex Atkins. Atkins was an asset as a recruiter, unlike Adam Fuller, who was not. That is sort of the two sides of the coin. I'm surprised both with the timing right now of Alex Atkins' dismissal, and in general, I'm not surprised by anybody being dismissed from a 1-9 football team at Florida State because that's just not something that's really allowed in Tallahassee. Mm-hmm. I am surprised though because there was an element of the show cause with him. I've mentioned this on prior OTB podcast and also talked about on a message board pointing, I did feel there was a degree of, because of what he got his hand slapped for happened when he was in the service of FSU and doing something for FSU, that there was going to be a bit of protection. But I think just plain and simple, that unit has been so bad this year, such a detriment to the offense. The offense is DOA, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think it starts with the O-line. And I think that's probably ultimately what did him in. I think it also speaks to, it would have been awkward. You could have demoted Alex Atkins taking the OC title. That doesn't happen a whole heck of a lot in college football. Usually a guy will leave in a situation like that. I think that was one that could have happened, but it didn't need to. Like, if you feel like you need to demote the guy, you probably feel like you need to move on from the guy. I guess it's the best way. And FSU should truthfully go out and try to find a true OC to call games. I'm of the belief that that's an area where Mike Norvell should hand off his duties, his play calling duties, become more CEO like. My general sentiment about what happened today, I don't celebrate guys losing their jobs. That stinks.
No.
They're people. In Ron Dugans' case, he's a guy that wore the uniform here. So like, it stinks. It is part of the business, and they know that. I know that. We know that. But I do think today was a good step for FSU in the sense of, you just needed to restore some belief within the fan base that these things were going to happen. And I do believe moving on from both coordinators are indicative of the belief that drastic, massive change has to come. And I'll add, this was something we kind of talked about pre-show, Trey. One thing I was told in conversations I've had in the last couple of weeks about how we expected November to play into December and the change to happen whenever it was going to come, was I've been told that Mike Norvell is going to be allowed to make the changes. This isn't something where there's an overseer or somebody in the hierarchy above him who's telling him, you have to dismiss Alex Atkins, you have to dismiss Adam Fuller. Ultimately, I was told there was some insulation, was the word used, on Mike Norvell, but ultimately he was going to be allowed to make his decisions. But there had been conversations of, obviously, the expectations of the program and the fact that FSU has fallen dramatically short of that this year, and the financial implications of all this, because let's not act like it's big business. It is. And Mike Norvell went and started making those changes today. I think it speaks to the likelihood that he does truly have a want and a desire to flip this thing back around. I mean, he's miserable, and dealing with him throughout the season as this thing's gone sideways and gotten worse. He hates it. He's an optimistic person who literally every day wakes up with the focus in season is the next game. It's the next practice to prepare for the next game. That's how he thinks. He really struggles, in my opinion, to probably step away from that mindset, because it's always been his mindset, at least in the 5 years I've dealt with him, and take the bigger picture approach, which I think was going to come for him once that Florida game ended for sure. But I feel like this is indicative of, he's definitely evaluated things. He made that comment in a press conference recently on a Monday, I believe it was, or it may have been after the game here against UNC that he said that, and that changes were going to come, and he's acted on that. Now, I think everybody, and I'm not trying to be bloodthirsty or have bloodlust, but I think everybody believes that more change probably does need to come. And I think when you're moving on from coordinators, especially in the case of defensive coordinator, because they're going to hire someone who is a defensive coordinator in every intent of the word, that they're going to be given the luxury to go and hire a majority of their own staff for that side of the ball, or at least certainly another coach on that side of the ball who's sort of their lean on guy, the guy who knows their system, knows how they operate, knows the language, can help install. That's pretty common with coordinators when they're hired, is they're usually allowed to make at least one definitive hire that is their guy. So you suspect that happens on the defensive side of the ball. And offensively, we'll see if Mike moves on from play calling. I think that's obviously a really, really big storyline as we learn about who they're going to look at about hiring to replace Alex Atkins in that role entirely.
Well, I think you made a lot of good points there, Chris. And I think the couple things that I want to emphasize is that, especially because this is Mike Norvell's situation, this was not something that was foisted upon him from outside forces. He was not influenced upon anything. This was his decision to do it at this time. And to me, that's a positive, because these are coaches, like you mentioned, things had to change. This is a historic disappointment. This is a calamity.
1 and 9 is not allowed to happen at Florida State.
It's a disaster, right? So it had to happen. But these are coaches that have had success here at this school. Ron Dugans, guy won a national championship for you, brought in a bunch of good receivers from the transfer portal, had a good wide receiver class the year before. His unit was abysmal. He had to go. He's a guy that can't have success at another place. His message was falling flat here, clearly. Adam Fuller basically his unit won the ACC championship for you.
Right.
He was
MNLT.
That's right. Him and LT. His defense was why the snub hurt so much, because they were playing at such a high level. And you see what those guys are doing today in the NFL. So that is a guy that has had success here, high level. But I think if we had to look at with the recruiting and somebody whose message is kind of fallen tone deaf at this point, I think 2023 was his ceiling. And for Mike to recognize that with the guy that he has trusted, with the dude that he brought from Memphis, that means he's serious. But the one to me that really opened my eyes was Alex Atkins, like you said, because this is a guy, when he came in as the offensive line coach, the worst position unit in Florida State history. He really had to rebuild that from the ashes. He did through the transfer portal, brought it up, was on the ascendancy. A coach, his name was like mentioned for like head coaching jobs at Tulane, who got promoted the offensive coordinator job after Kenny Dillingham got the head coaching job at Arizona State, a guy that was earmarked for future success. But everything about this offense, it's the worst in the country. It's the worst scoring offense. There is no reason for it to be this bad. So even though, in my opinion, based on results, Alex was the one that needed to be dealt with the most based on if this is a results business. That's the one that's most surprising because of the show cause, because of how close they are, and just because of Mike's affinity for his offensive guys. So to me, especially knowing what you said, Chris, that he's the one making this decision, that is big to me. I was hesitant if it was just going to be a couple changes here at the margins, maybe some guys moving on to a different role. This is big. Because when offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators come in, they want some degree of control, specifically on the defensive side. Mike's an offensive guy. He really lets the defensive coach that side of the ball and have almost total autonomy over that unit. So if you got to give somebody total autonomy over that unit, they're going to want to bring in their guys. So there is going to be more changes coming. But that Alex Atkins one, that is one that shows me that he's serious and he's tired of being embarrassed week after week after week after week, because this is a season that is starting to become a stain on his reputation as an offensive guru and his legacy as a head coach. So he understands the gravity of the situation. And I think that, number one, we don't want to celebrate. All these guys have had success here. They've been a big part of what happened in 2022 and 2023. I think they will have success elsewhere. It just wasn't working out here anymore. And that's the nature of the situation. And a lot of times that's the nature of college football. As far as back, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to add, there's a degree, and you mentioned it earlier with regards to Florida. There's a degree of messaging, and it's clear as day that with this team, the messaging fell on deaf ears. Mm-hmm. The culture rotted in an insanely quick time. I think that has a lot to do with departed players, but it was amazing that there was so little carryover. And I guess it makes sense in retrospect. Hindsight's a beautiful thing. That, you know, some of the guys I had hoped would carry it over obviously had ulterior motives with regards to their offseason. Don't want to get into that on this pod. We've talked about that before, but, you know, that played a role. But there's certainly an element of, like, you know, we watch a lot of practice. The coach is coach. Like, one of the greatest assets about FSU staff was that they do truly coach. Like, they get after it. And it just, none of it clung to anybody this year. And it's painful. It's gotten worse. I mean, point differential, yards given up, teams running right through FSU from a defensive standpoint, FSU's inability on offense to launch ever. It's really, really bad. I don't know where you want to go next, Trey. Could also talk about the financials of these three moves.
Yeah, go ahead. Because that's something that is, with Florida State being in the position that they are with the Doak renovations, a football-only facility, in a costly legal battle with your conference. What are the financial implications of these moves?
Well, we'll start with the conversation about Mike Norvell. Why wouldn't FSU move on from Mike Norvell? 85% of his contract would be owed to him. He signed a very lengthy, highly lucrative, hefty contract last year. That's a sum that's probably insurmountable right now for change. Plus, you're dealing with a guy who did have a great deal of success the last 2 years versus this year. Usually there's a degree of give him a chance to fix it. It saves us money by doing that, in the sense of not doing a total flip. A total flip would be total sum probably in $120 to $140 million range if you were to gut the entire staff top to bottom and hire an entirely new staff top to bottom. And that's not all at one time. That's grand total cost. You know, contract figures for the duration of it, but still, it's a hell of a lot of money. So on Alex Atkins, 2 years left on the contract, 1.3 in 25, 1.4 million in 26 is what he's owed. So that's 2.7 over those 2 years. Adam Fuller, I believe it's $2 million for each of the next 2 years. I'm pulling that up right now to be sure. It's a 2-year deal in his case.
Mm-hmm.
Gotta love when technology decides to,
But
take a
it's
break.
around a $4 million investment because he did just get a massive bump based on what happened at the end of the year. Like he was like a top 10 paid coordinator in the country, right? On the defense side.
Yeah, and every coach last year on the staff, was extended. So there's a degree of having to deal with that. People be like, well, they shouldn't have done that. Yeah, but they were coming off 23 wins. Like, I love, he is due $4 million that can be paid out in installments equal to biweekly or monthly payments over the course of the remainder of the contract, which expires in February of 26. So yeah, it's $2 million per year is the average. And then on Dugan's case, it's far less of a financial hit as those two, which is to be expected because they're coordinators.
Mm-hmm.
He is owed $625,000, roughly $625,000. That can be paid in installments through the remainder of the contract, which is February of 2026.
So all in, you're about these moves today. All in total about
a year, so it's 1.25 over 2.
Yeah, so he got a 2-year extension. Ron did.
He is through 26. I don't know if technically his extension was 2 years.
Okay.
I don't remember off the top of my head, but most contracts for FSU run through February of 26. That's sort of how the assistant staff was put on sort of a consistent timeline in the last year as they extended everybody alongside when Norvell got the extension surrounding the Alabama stuff.
So 6.7 plus 1.2, you're looking at today was an $8 million total day. Like that's not chump change either, but based on how much money you are actively losing by having a bad football team, this needed to happen. Like this, you are actually staring down the barrel of a way, way, way more dire financial situation if you continue to suck this bad. Well, I guess where I want to go with this next, Brendan's going to have, everybody wants to talk about hot board season. Like there will be some names, I think, on the site. Brendan's compiling some names that make sense. That's something that we'll get to specifics.
We put up about 20 minutes ago, just kind of like names to know. I'm not quite ready to call it hot board season, even though we've now entered the phrase.
Warm board.
Names to know. These are usually people that are either, risers in the business, people that have some kind of connection to Mike Norvell or the staff in some form or fashion, or have a familiarity with the staff. We know they've been around them previously, or they've coached against them and liked them, things like that. So he put it up. Brendan's traveling right now, getting back from South Bend. So I think he's actually on a plane at this moment. So when we do an OTB here in the coming days, with it being a bye week, we'll dive definitely more in on those names because that's been his little pet project here the last couple of weeks as we've shifted a bit from covering practices as we were because there's not a whole lot of return on that. So he was very focused on some of this in preparation for whenever this was going to come, whether it was this week, next week, end of November.
It was inevitable. And that Brendan, like I said, no freebies. Go to the site, look at the names. Brendan will discuss them in a day or two. Two other things I want to talk about. These are big moves, Chris. These are seismic moves for the program. You talked about seeing in practice the overall message deteriorating. Do we think that it still might not be enough? Do we think that there is actually a deeper root cause of this problem, and it's Mike Norvell's message in general? Do we think that even with these new voices, with this new surge of excitement, getting the fan base back, getting the boosters back, do we think that the original message, do we think that what's happened this year, that it's too rotten to continue? Like, are you worried about that? The foundation is still being unsteady.
Yeah, certainly. In this day and age of the portal, I definitely feel that way. FSU's been a relatively portal-dependent program. While they like the last two classes they've brought in, they hope to retain a decent amount of those guys. They are somewhat the backbone of them. So much of that team's been built on one-year portal-type guys or multi-year portal guys who are in their first year. And I think that's sort of where some of the raw and the lack of buy-in has definitely set in. Do I think his message is a bit stale? Yeah, I think Mike Norvell has never been a head coach at a university going into a 6th year ever before.
No, not even as an offensive coordinator, right?
He had a great deal of success here with the climb and everything they did. I'm not really going to count 20 because 20 is not a real year in college football standards, especially for a first-year coach. Yeah. But 21 to 22, there was improvement, and then you certainly saw it in 23. 22 launched into 23, and they ran with it. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that. Messaging was part of it. Culture, player-led, very, very good player-led team last year. This year's team, not so much, sadly. I think he does have to reinvent himself to some degree. I have certainly felt that way. I think I've tried to write that, express that. I wrote changes necessary for him a couple weeks ago after one of the losses, and yeah, I feel that way. I think that there's a degree of uh, one, figuring out how are you building your team, whether it's a mix of portal, a mix of high school, which I think it's certainly going to continue to be, at least for the short term. They're going to have to be portal reliant because it is so late in the cycle. They're going to struggle to get a whole lot of high school talent in for this current class. But
Right.
there's a degree of figuring out draw a line in the sand and figure out which side guys are on. And guys who are currently in your program who you aren't sure on, you're not sold on, you don't think are good enough for your program, or you don't think are invested enough in your program, do not hesitate to move on from them. You've got to do it. There's got to be a flush. There's got to be a focus on who you believe you can win with, and then going to accumulate talent, enough good players to formulate a two deep that can allow you to be competitive in a much better football team last year than you were this year. And I think that's certainly an area. But messaging wise, yeah, I think it has to change. I think for guys who were here in 22, 23, and now this year, or last year, now this year, who will be here next year, I think it's difficult for them to hear the same thing they previously heard.
Sure.
And know how to navigate that. I think there's a degree of Mike has to, he's not going to completely reinvent himself. He's very much a creature of habit in many ways. But I think there's a degree of, like, he's got to figure out the next message. Like, he wants this program to be sustained and good. He wants to be good here. He's not a guy who's looking to leave. So how does he go about ensuring his future here? Because everybody, myself, media, fans, onlookers from outside the program, other programs, they're going to be skeptical because FSU has been dreadful and awful in 2024 and almost unimaginably bad at a university like Florida State. 1-9 and likely 2-10, fingers crossed, is not something that ever happens here, is ever acceptable here, is ever something that people can stomach. It's also sort of mind-blowing. It just shouldn't happen at a place like FSU. It shouldn't happen at about 15 to 20 programs in the country. It does happen once in a blue moon. Very rarely. It's never happened here in the last 50 years. I think for Mike, it's about figuring out how do you reinvigorate it? How do you get it moving forward? How basically do you get away from everything that's basically happened for you and for your program since early December of last year when the snub happened? And I'm not one who likes to blame the snub for what's happened this year.
Mm-hmm.
But there has been a lack of consistently good feeling momentum around here that existed for much of the prior 18 months before that. And it's about getting back there, but I think you got to get back there with a different route than you used to take, that you took to get there the first time around. So yes, long-winded answer. I do think the messaging has to change.
Good detail, though. So speaking
Mike
of,
also has to change.
yes,
He has to become more CEO. Has to change how he recruits. And Zach's done a lot of his road to rebuild. How he recruits, the NIL strategy of Florida State probably has to change. Coaching as an offensive coordinator probably has to change. There's a whole lot of elements like that where maybe not all of them, but I think there has to be a healthy shift in the way he goes about it. And I think it's just what the business demands. I think it's tough to stay the same as a college football coach and continually have success. Very few do. For every Saban in the world or Bobby in the world, there's a lot of guys that, have fleeting success. They have a couple years of it and it goes away.
Yeah, more so than the former, absolutely. So you hit on a good point, and that's what I want to talk about. So we know what we think that they need to emphasize with these new coordinators, the hirings, the vacancies that have been announced today, and the vacancies still to come, in my opinion. So we know what we think Mike needs to emphasize. The question is, what do you project him to emphasize, Chris? Obviously, throughout his tenure at Florida State, he has emphasized coaching, development, familiarity, internal promotions, things of that nature. Do you think that he emphasizes that again? Or do you think that on the defensive side of the ball, he goes with like a young up-and-coming, like cutthroat recruiter, assassin type? On the offensive side of the ball, do you think that he goes from somebody outside of his Norvell offense tree and gets a totally new voice in there to reinvigorate some of these passing concepts, some of the formational things? Like, what do you think actually happens? Not what we think needs to happen. What do you think actually happens? I would have told you before today, I would have thought it would have been a little bit more of the same, different at the margins. Today, with some of the names that were announced, I am a little bit more encouraged. But what do you think ultimately happens with these, specifically the coordinator hires? What is he going to emphasize?
I think defensively he's going to be fairly open-minded. Age range probably doesn't matter. I think it's about getting a very good coach who he thinks can identify football players for his system at a high level, has the ability to then go acquire said players as a recruiter. And I don't think like age is going to matter. I don't think necessarily, 20 years of experience as a coordinator versus 4 years of experience as a coordinator is going to be one of those that gets weight. I think it's about going to find the guy who he thinks is sort of the guy who can have the fingerprints, can motivate a defense, can build a defense and do it. Offensively, I think he probably ends up with someone who's relatively like-minded to him in the sense of offensive strategy, not necessarily system. But the idea of what you're trying to accomplish, explosives being one of the big things I'm thinking of in that conversation, and someone that, again, can go and recruit talent. Now, I'm interested, will he shuffle his I think more defensive change is more likely than more offensive change. I think there will be more change on both sides, but I think defense is going to look dramatically different. I think offense is still going to have a few of the folks that we know hanging around. I'm interested how roles may shift, things of that sort on the offensive side of ball. I think, short answer for you, Trey, I think offense is still going to have a whole lot of Mike Norvell fingerprints on it. That being said, I do believe if he was to hand off play calling duties, he would truly hand them off. I don't think he's going to be overbearing or grabbing the headset, as they like to say, and doing that stuff. I don't think that's what he would do. But I do think he would probably hire someone who he feels he thinks similar to. Because, for example, when Kenny did it, he and Kenny were so like
simpatico.
Yeah, they thought so much alike. And I'm not familiar enough with Chip Long and his offensive play calling when he worked for Mike to say if that was the same. But I presume a lot of what Long did, Mike wholeheartedly approved of, just based on the experience of Mike at FSU for 5 years. Defensively, I think it's solely about getting it right. Who do you hire? They got to be better on that side of ball at recruiting high school defensive line talent. They've just not been any good at it. Well, they've gotten some great transfer talent on that side of ball. The high school stuff's left a ton to be desired. I think that's something that there's massive focus on. I think linebacker can't be the Achilles heel that it's tried to be in some forms and fashions in recent years. It's got to be an upgrade there. And, the secondary is always something that they want to throw a lot of bodies at and have a lot of versatility and talent. I don't think those things change a whole lot with regards to sort of what they project as what they want to do. I do think the thing that changes is that they're going to try to be a much better staff at actually going and accumulating that talent. There's been a whole lot of, me, Zach, Brendan, and company have our thread where we share stuff. It's amazing how many guys we've dealt with, whether transfer or high school, on defense, who are really, really good football players, who FSU had a legitimate shot at, was in the mix with, identified early high school talent-wise, or was in really early the minute they hit the portal, stuff like that they didn't get, who go and turn into really good football players. I think the goal is to get more of those on campus. I think that's ultimately where defense has to go. Because, not trying to knock dudes, but like a Kevin Knowles is still a consistent starter for FSU. He is somebody you should have recruited over.
And there's many such examples.
Yeah. And I'm not trying to pick on individual guys. Just saying, I think there's got to be a shift to acquiring better talent on that side of ball and consistently acquiring it, not singular year, having it year over year.
And I think defense too, with all of the rule sets that are in advantage to the offense in the game of modern football, talent is so much more paramount on defense. Like there's a reason why the 5 best defensive schools are the 5 best defensive schools year after year. Look where they're at in the recruiting rankings. Defense really is a reflection of team talent. The offense, to me, I think that's what's really going to show. Is this like a Mike Norvell 2.0? Or is this just kind of like a Mike Norvell 1.5? Like, are we just going to kind of run the same stuff with some familiar guys? Like, are we going to kind of go back to secure, familiar concepts? I think that side of the ball, especially after watching all of the film from every single game, you want to talk about a spot on the team. Number one, you're the worst in the country that needs fresh new voices and definitely needs a way better self-scout and self-evaluation. Teams knowing exactly what you're doing and having answers for it and not even have to go to their second-order solutions on defense. Like, that needs fresh voices. So That's, to me, that's the story of the offseason for me, is what happens on the offensive side of the ball, just because they have been so historically abysmal. I'm interested, man. Like, this covering this team just got more interesting for everybody. It really did.
Yeah, it
And
was.
it's a shame that it had to happen in the wake of guys losing their jobs. But man, it sucks to say, but it was completely necessary.
Yeah, I mean, post Duke game, they had a chance to sort of, not stabilize it, but make it feel a lot better, get to the finish line, and then address it. It's gone so sideways since then. They've been such a horrible football team, really all year, but especially the last 3 weeks. And you reach a point of no return, and they certainly reached that. I think honestly, they reached that UNC game. You lose to your rival Miami, play that badly, come out play UNC, who's basically a one-man offense with Hampton, who's a great player, and you got throttled, and yeah, it's game over. So,
Yeah, it's things like self-respect and pride started to like shape a lot of these decisions, man. There's only so much embarrassment you can take, but today was a step in the right direction, in my opinion. There's going to be a whole lot of stuff to cover on Noles247.com. Go ahead, hit the site, check out that names to know list. We'll go over it in more detail. Maybe we'll accompany that with some film analysis, things like that. We are here to serve you, our friends, the viewers. Whatever you want, hit to Noles247.com. It's a great time to subscribe right before early signing day. Now we're in, not yet, we're in warm board season, about to be hot board season. And we're going to all the things that encompass that. Hit the site. Chris, anything else that you have to say before I go finish hooking up the rest of my Christmas tree?
Well, one, I appreciate you, darting inside and getting this done. Much appreciated. The other thing is, in addition to what Trey just did a great job selling, Zach is also working on getting up with recruits, but commitments and targets, just about what today's news means for them and their recruitments. And, in the case of FSU, if they're committed, what it means for their commitment. He did get up with Solomon Thomas, who did not want to issue any real comment on it. Zach did say he sounded disappointed. He had a really, really good relationship with Alex Atkins, and he's a relationship-based kid. That's one that FSU is going to have to really battle to weather the storm. But, it's sort of you can't keep coaches because of recruits. That's just part of business. But yeah, we're good here. We'll have more, much more in the coming days. Once everybody's back in Tallahassee, we do get Mike Norvell tomorrow, Monday, for a press conference on the bye week. That's really the only thing we're doing on the bye week, and that was all predetermined before Notre Dame. So this wasn't reactionary to Notre Dame or reactionary to the coaching changes. This was sort of we're all kind of tired of seeing each other, and it's been a dreadfully long year. So we're going to let the bye week be a bye week after we get Mike Norvell. And then obviously we roll into a normal game week for FSU's homecoming with Charleston Southern, and we'll have a ton of coverage there. That will be interesting from a practice standpoint, just watching how the dynamics change with different voices, different people leading different positions and stuff like that. So that will be probably one of those things that, will make practice more interesting than it's been for much of the last few weeks.
Well, they're tired of seeing each other, but we are not tired of seeing you on Noles247.com. Hit the site, read the analysis, get the scoop. We love you guys. Things are happening, and we'll be here to walk you through it all. For Chris Nee, I'm Trey Rowland. Thank you for spending your Sunday afternoon with us. We love you. We appreciate your resilience. The season has been a complete monumental test of fortitude, and you're still sticking with us. We love you guys. Keep chopping. It takes a long